I thought 1,000 different ways of what to say today. And I thought, you know what, it's just best to stay with the text. It's just best to stay with the text. And it's interesting if the text really feels appropriate to me today. It feels appropriate in many ways. I have to admit, back in May when I announced that this day would be coming, I couldn't believe it when the text said, and you'll be with me just but a short while longer. I'm going, oh, are you serious? And now today it's like, okay, what about this image of the mustard seed? What about, we've talked about this image a couple of times, a number of times over 14 years. And what about this image of this mustard seed? You know, growing up, I would say this was always interpreted to me either as an allegory, right? Just like the mustard seed starts small and grows, so might your faith grow, you know, like the mustard seed. You know, or it comes to you as a fable. Or it comes to you as a fable. Sometimes, you know, very large things have small beginnings, and therefore, though your faith may feel small at this time, God has the power to grow it into something grand and large. And so, you know, these interpretations are interesting. They've been used probably many times, even with these texts. But the truth are, you know, fables and allegories are meant to teach. They're meant to instruct. They're meant to edify. And for the most part, allegories and fables are safe. And allegories and fables are comfortable. But that's not the intent when Jesus says, what parable should I use? He doesn't want to talk in an allegory, and he doesn't want to talk in a fable. He wants to talk in a parable, and parables are not allegories or fables. They have a specific purpose, and they are meant to overturn the way in which we are presently thinking. That's why Jesus spoke in parables. It's meant to overturn the way we presently think. To turn us around. That's meant to cause frustration. And yet, it can also cause transformation and deep understanding. But that's the nature of a parable. So Jesus goes on, and he says, well, what parable should I choose? And in this chapter of Mark, he just goes parable after parable after parable. And you'll see that there's a group of people who feel transformed by it, and there's a group of people who feel frustrated and turned upside down by it. And that is precisely the context in which we're living in. At least first century Palestine is living in, right? I mean, basically you have this division between the aristocracy and the peasant class. You basically have this division. You've got the nobility and the priestly class who are all feeling entitled to privilege and are dressing and they're making sure that privilege stays intact through the purity codes of the temple and making sure everybody stays in line. And so they use the purity code for control. And then on the other hand, you have sort of this middle class, I suppose, which is made up of the artisan population that's basically dotting the small towns, but basically barely eking out a living. They're just on the edge, just on the edge of poverty. And then you have the true peasant class, those who work the fields, the day laborers, those who watch the sheep, like David we just read about. Interesting that he would come into some sense of power here, as he's the last one out with the sheep. Right? And this is basically the way the society is made up. And then, of course, as I mentioned, those who work the land. And if you're a peasant and you hear a parables about seeds, the land, as so many of Jesus did, how do you suppose they would respond to these teachings when he speaks in these words? It's like a mustard seed.
Positive, because he's talking to their knowledge.
So in some ways they would receive this as a positive image because he's speaking to their awareness, to their knowledge, to their life circumstance, something that they're living, their lived experience. He's speaking to their lived experience. And why do you suppose the parables were always so puzzling to the priests, the Sadducees, and the aristocracy?
They had no concept of some of the things that Jesus was saying.
They had no concept of what it was like to actually work the land. They reaped the benefits, the profits, off the laborers, but they really had no idea what it was to be there and getting their hands dirty. And the peasants would have understood this parable so quickly. This image of a seed, especially a mustard seed. I mean, yes, mustard seeds have different types of mustard seeds. You know, you can use it for spices, or you can use it for medicinally. But generally speaking, the peasants would have understood that the mustard seed is a weed. It's a weed, and it takes over. I mean, how many are trying to get gardens going now? And what is growing the best?
The weeds.
And which weeds are your favorite weeds? The ones that frustrate you the most? Oh, dandelions, huh? The crabgrass that takes over. But you get the idea? You get the idea. It takes over. And the campesino, not thinking in Spanish. The peasants would have known exactly that when he's talking about a mustard seed, he's talking about a weed, and it's going to take over. The kingdom of God is like something that's going to take over in our lives. It's going to turn our lives upside down. It's going to turn us upside down. It's going to take over where we don't want it. The kingdom of God is going to take over our lives in places where we just don't want it to take over. As a matter of fact, it's going to draw in birds, and they're going to be a nuisance too. We're trying to plant our crops. Oh, they're going to come and eat all the berries, right? I mean, what do we do with our blueberries? You throw it down to keep the birds away. And so Jesus is saying, oh, not only is the kingdom of God going to be like a weed, it's going to be like birds that eat all your berries. So now why do you suppose the aristocracy doesn't like this parable? Because it's threatening. It's talking about change. We could lose power. Well, what if the kingdom of God is going to, if it's going to really control our lives, then the way we're running our lives won't work. It just won't work. And Jesus is simply saying the kingdom of God is something we can't control. And that's why this is appropriate for today. And yet, imagine if we all imagined ourselves as little weeds of the kingdom. What would you want to take over? What would you want to change?
The way we live.
Maybe the way we live. Maybe the way we do church. Maybe we could stop saying we're the little white church. And we could say, oh, we're the little church of change. And something big can happen. Imagine. I mean, how would you like to envision the kingdom of God taking over your lives?
Acceptance.
I'd like to accept the fact that it's going to take me over like a weed. I would like to grow just like a good old weed. I mean, think about this. Where is this going, right? I mean, maybe we're more like the aristocracy. We don't like to have the idea of feeling out of control. We like to control. And yet God is saying, I'm gonna make you crazy. I'm going to have you lose all your control. And it's something new is going to be born, right? Something new is going to be born. You know, and that's, well, what kind of a message is that for you?
Challenging.
It's a hopeful message. It's a hopeful message. You know, and hope maybe brings joy, but joy and hope are different. Joy can cheer you up, but hope isn't about cheering up. It's saying, I believe in the possibility of change, and it moves us to action. Hope is almost like a verb. It moves us to action. I believe this can happen. And then we begin to move. That's the role of hope. That's the role of hope, of the kingdom taking over our lives. And though we might feel diminished in places, God is looking to make big changes in each and every one of us. And I hope we can have dangerous hopes. I hope we can have dangerous hopes in Jesus.